bringing now the ranking member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Democrat Bob Menendez of New Jersey. Bob, we were just talking about what our Secretary of Defense had said about NATO a year or so ago, that it's so important that if NATO didn't exist, we would have to create it. I take it from the vote yesterday in the United States Senate, that is the unanimous agreement of at least all the Democrats and every Republican except for two.
Well, yes, Joe, it's the near unanimous agreement except for two Republicans. And today, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee will mark up an even more significant resolution that speaks to the importance of the NATO alliance, an alliance that has brought us peace and prosperity for 73 years. It was there in the aftermath of World War II. It was there to win the Cold War. It was there on September 11th when the only time that NATO has invoked a mutual self-defense provision was on behalf of the United States after it was struck on that tragic day on September 11th. And for 17 years, NATO allies have fought with us in Afghanistan and in other engagements across the globe. So this is a critical part of our security infrastructure, and at the same time, it has created prosperity that we have been part of enjoying in a significant market for United States products and services. So this is critical, and it's so upsetting to see that Putin, whose number one goal is to divide the West, and particularly in NATO, has an American president doing his work for him in a way that all of his cyber attacks and Twitter disinformation and trolls have been unable to achieve. Putin made a great investment in the 2016 presidential elections, and it's paying off for him in Brussels today.
So what does the United States Senate do? What can it do in a bipartisan way to send a message to our NATO allies as well as to Russia that despite the fact that we have a president who said Vladimir Putin would be the easiest part of his trip, and that our Democratic allies who have stood by our side since 1945 were going to be the most difficult, what do we do to right-size this relationship again that our commander-in-chief is turning upside down?
Well, yesterday, for the beginning, as you pointed out, Joe, the Senate spoke in a strong bipartisan vote on the defense appropriation bill, the National Defense Authorization Act. Today, the Senate will speak through the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, I think in a near unanimous effort. Maybe one colleague, Rand Paul, may not be there, in solidifying the NATO relationship from a national foreign policy and national security interest. Thirdly, I said on the Senate floor yesterday, and I will continue, as my colleagues will continue to echo, that sanctions against Russia is not a question of discretion for the president. When we wrote CATSA, the Countering Americans' Adversaries Through Sanctions Act, it was the first time in all of the sanctions that I have helped author, whether it be against Iran or in this case against Russia, that the Congress did not provide the discretion to an American president and insisted on mandatory sanctions if certain actions by Russia were taken. Those actions can only be undone. I mean, those sanctions can only be undone by the Senate. So I think that those are three critical elements of sending a very clear message to our NATO allies that the Congress, an expression of the will of the American people, believes in NATO and the importance of it.
Senator, we're listening to you, and we respect your views, and they're fairly strong views about your opposition to what the president is doing. But what the president is actually doing, it seems, is undermining 75 years of peace, stability, and progress in disrupting NATO. And it seems as if he is intent on basically destabilizing NATO to the point where the European Union is weakened. Why then do we not hear more voices come out more strongly, like yours, on the floor of the United States Senate and elsewhere, in unison about what this president is doing to our history and our country?
Well, look, I think the vote yesterday speaks loudly. I would hope that my Republican colleagues, NATO has been the bulwark of our security architecture in which both Democratic and Republican presidents and administrations and my colleagues have been some of the strongest voices on the Republican side of the aisle in support of NATO. Their muted voices today, other than through their vote, is a concern to me, only because we need to send a robust message to all of Europe, and particularly to our NATO allies, and to Russia, who is an adversary. It worries me that the president is going to a meeting with Putin where he describes Putin as a competitor. Putin is not a competitor. He is an adversary, in my view, a foe. And so ultimately, when you go into a meeting thinking that someone is just a competitor, that's a strategically different train of thought than when someone is an adversary. Putin is an adversary. And so I hope that our colleagues will raise their voices, as they have in the past. All they need to do is go back and look at their speeches, and those speeches are as relevant today as they were when they made it before.
All right, Senator Bob Menendez, thank you so much for being with us. We appreciate it. Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.